All right, we are live. Sorry about the slight delay in getting started. The YouTube page was not recognizing the stream from Zoom, so just reloaded the page and it worked fine. So I don't know if there's some congestion or whatnot, but we are live now. So thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about Bilal Philips's Dawah manual. In the previous episodes on this manual, we've kind of looked at just an introduction to what Dawah is. We looked at how Bilal uses or redefines terms to try to get the result he wants, how he constantly throws in irrelevant material unrelated to what he's talking about, apparently just to give this subtle impression that, you know, all Christians are idiots and stuff like that. And then we looked at his section on how to do Dawah for Christians. We noted that there was not one positive argument for Islam in the entire section, that it was exclusively about trying to tear down Christian beliefs. And we definitely see this kind of behavior when we talk to Muslims online. So, you know, looking at this manual is kind of giving us a better understanding of the way Muslims think, and hopefully as a result is allowing people to craft their arguments to better reach Muslims. Today we're going to be looking at the final section of the Dawah manual, which is titled Difficult Questions While Doing Dawah. In this section, Bilal is going to look at some of the common things that critics of Islam always bring up, you know, Muhammad marrying a young child, and Islam allowing violence against, or encouraging violence even, against apostates, and other things along those lines. So before we get started, let me just open us in a quick word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with fellow Christians as well as unbelievers around the world. Islam has lived in a bubble for most of its 1400-year history, and things are starting to change now. And we just are very thankful that we are alive at a time when we can actually do something to reach Muslims. We know that they are lost people. Most Muslims are very good people by the standards of human beings. So we don't want to hate them. In fact, if we did hate them, we wouldn't be trying to reach them. Instead, what we want to do is reach them, bring them to the truth, bring them out of the depraved religion, bring them out of the following a God who has inferior morals to their own, and ultimately to bring them all to you. So we just ask that you be with us today, that you guide our conversation, and that anyone listening approaches the subject material with an open mind. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So before we dive into the Dawah manual, I thought we'd give people a few minutes to show up by talking about our last video, which was Make Me a Muslim Day. I sent out an invitation to more than 100 different Muslims who had commented on my channel. I put invitations on various Muslim forums, and we did have a fair number of Muslims show up live. But unfortunately, none of them could even really attempt to formulate an argument for Islam. It's now been up about a week, and we're seeing the same thing in the comments. All we are seeing is anger and attempts to attack Christianity, attempts to change the subject, no arguments for Islam. Lloyd, why don't you tell us a little bit about your engagement in the comment section over the last few days?
Yeah, I've been very, very active in the comment section. Those of you who know me probably realize just how active I am in the comments. And one of my favorite comments was from Yusuf yesterday was, I don't think with my brain. We screen capped these. These are gems. Yeah, one of the most intriguing discussions that I had during the entire week was with someone called Aiden, who claimed to be a Christian, but something like a Gnostic Christian. And he said that he was looking for the truth and he wanted to despite not being a Christian, despite not believing in the Trinity, not believing that Jesus was entirely divine, he wanted to minister to Christians and save them from sin. He didn't quite define what exactly the sin was. However, he gave away a few clues, and we were able to discern that he is a Muslim convert or revert, and he's actually active, or has been active, with a Dawah team at Speaker's Corner. So he was lying. Then I had another, and after 200 comments, when I started asking him about these very pointed questions, he deleted the entire thread. So, but he immediately tripped my instincts, my alarm, and so yeah, I knew that this guy was not being entirely honest. Then we had Yusuf, and Yusuf claimed to be a Quranist, and this is a very, very common tactic. Yusuf has claimed that 99.9% of all Muslims are not actually Muslims. They're deceived, they're lied to, that every single scholar and every single book outside of the Hanafi manuals apparently are false, are fabricated, that all Muslims are following the wrong religion, and that he can't tell me who is a good Muslim, but he is. That's one person out of 1.4 billion. And so every single reference, every single book, every single thing in Islam is apparently false. And so we've asked him, why don't you tell Islam QA? Because 400 million Muslims a month go to Islam QA for advice. And he says he tries to tell them, but they won't listen to him.
I wonder why.
So he says that these imams who go study for 7 years are learning falsehoods. So yeah, this is, I mean, but he first claimed to be a Quranist, and he only listened to the Quran, and it turns out he admitted he was not, because I asked him, where in the Quran do you find the instructions for properly performing the 5 daily prayers? And I asked him, where do you find the instructions for performing a wedding? Because they're not in the Quran. So he couldn't, and eventually had to admit, well, I do follow certain books, and yeah. They all said that they don't want you talking about these other books. They deny their own scriptures, which is disgusting. How do you deny your own books to defend them? How do you lie about your own religion to defend it?
Yeah, and then, you refer to the famous Muslim scholars that he specifically said that he follows, and then, you point out that they believe in Sharia law and whatnot, and he's like, well, their books have been changed. So I guess he alone, out of all the Muslims in the entire world, has figured out the truth. And this is what we see in Islam. This is the only religion that I've ever encountered that people deny the truth of all of its scriptures, all of its holy sources, in order to try to prove that it's true. Whatever you don't like, that's not a true thing. It doesn't matter if it's Hadith or Sharia or Sirah or even the Quran. If you don't like it, that's a mistranslation, that was changed, that's fake, liars made that, whatever. It's just really, really strange to me.
What's crazy that these people will say, I mean, as you say, that all of these things are false. The Hadith, the biographies of Muhammad are all written by liars, and all of these are lies. But despite that, the same scholars transmitted the Quran, and yet Islam is true, but 99.9% of its literature is entirely false. And yet they'll say, yeah, well, there's a discrepancy in Mark and Matthew at what time Jesus died by a couple of hours or the day or whatever. And that falsifies Christianity, but Islam can literally have thousands of lying, deceitful scholars who wrote thousands of lying, deceitful Islamic books, but Islam is 100% true.
Yeah, it's really strange. Constance says, how can one understand the Quran without the Hadith? And I mean, the honest answer is you can't. The Quran is very ambiguous. It's very unclear, despite its constant claims about itself that it explains everything in detail. If you ask a Muslim, where in the Quran do you find the 5 daily prayers? I don't know. It's in there somewhere. Where do you find the Hajj? Oh, I don't know. It's in there somewhere. And where do you find the Shahada? I don't know, but everyone knows that's part of Islam. And it's like, yeah, all these things come from the Hadith. Your religion is based on the Hadith that you tell us are lies whenever you want to remove some embarrassing fact found in them.
Incredible. Incredible. I mean, they must be really ashamed and humiliated of the things in Islam that they read or that they learn about. But they can't believe it's true because they believe Muhammad is really perfect, and they're shocked to find out the things that he actually did and said.
Definitely. So should we go ahead and dive into the Dawah manual?
I will share my screen as long as that's enabled.
Yep, I remembered to enable it this time. So as
Great.
I said, we've been going through Bilal Phillips's Dawah manual. If you didn't catch any of the previous parts, no worries. You're going to recognize today's material from, if you've had any conversations with Muslims, you'll know all about the types of excuses that Bilal gives today. We're looking at this to kind of show that there isn't any better argument than the ones you hear in the comment sections. You know, Bilal is an expert scholar on Islam, and he doesn't really have any better explanations. To his credit, he doesn't try to deny any of these things. He's not one of those people who says, oh, the hadith are fake. Aisha wasn't actually 9, she was 18. How do I know that? Well, I pulled it out of my ass, but it's still true because Islam is true, and I can't believe that Aisha could be 9. So he doesn't deny that she's 9, but he doesn't have any better excuses or reasons than we
No.
see in.
But also, they won't engage with the content. I mean, I'll tell them, look, Aisha says, according to the finest scholar, the most famous scholar of Islam after Muhammad, which is Al-Ghazali, Aisha says that Muhammad pretended to be a prophet from Allah. And I asked them, so tell me about this. Why would his wife, and why would the greatest scholar in Islam write this? And why would his wife say this? And they will ignore this completely. I mean, I asked them, is she alive? You know, is Muhammad's wife alive? But they will totally ignore this. They simply just shut their eyes and they cannot engage with this. It's dishonest. Okay.
There was a comment that my volume was a little low, so hopefully that's better now.
That sounded fine to me. So yes, this is the first difficult question that Bilal Philips brings up.
Before we dive into the question itself, I first wanted to point out that I think it's very revealing that he leaves this to the very last section of the book. He had a section of general, what he called general issues of doing Dawah, where he raised some difficult questions, mostly related to women's rights, but he completely ignored the most pressing issues for Islam. And then he hit it at the very end, kind of like as an appendix almost, long after he's given all this advice of how to attack Christianity and whatnot. And I think that he knows he needed to address these things because some Muslims will know about them, but at the same time, he doesn't want to bring them to the minds of ignorant Muslims who don't already know about them. So he's kind of hiding these at the end. And then, of course, the first issue he dives into is this issue of pedophilia, which is not surprising because he knows that this is easily the most common and most damaging critique of Islam that Christians raise. So as we saw earlier, and we showed in a previous episode, Bilal has redefined pedophilia. And he does that again here in the appendix. He says pedophilia involves adults taking advantage of children by purchasing sexual favors from them. And then he tries to have this distraction about supposed sex tourists coming from the West, which is totally irrelevant. We condemn those things. So he just raises it for no reason. He doesn't think that those things justify Muhammad. He's just trying to distract. So what do you think about him redefining pedophilia here?
Well, he's also trying to say that it's okay to marry children because he says they are not seeking marriage. They just want sex, whereas we want marriage and then we'll have sex from these children. That's not taking advantage of children.
Yeah, and you know, it's actually very interesting that he says impoverished people willing to give their children away for a few pennies. I've read multiple articles from reputable sources about how it's actually common in places like Egypt and North Africa for sex tourists from the Middle East, primarily Saudi Arabia, to come there and quote unquote marry these girls for a few hours or a week or whatever, and then discard them. And then that poor girl can't get married to anyone else because she's no longer valued because she's not a virgin. And all she can do is then sell herself again. And somehow, because you call it marriage, it becomes fine. But we would call that prostitution, and not just prostitution, but abuse of children.
So it's mutta. I mean, being married for 1 to 3 hours or married overnight, so you can have a meaningful overnight relationship in a hotel room with a young girl for a few hours. Disgusting.
So then his point number 2 is that the age of consent for women in the West varies from 14 to 18. And he tries to say that these ages are just arbitrary. They're just decided by society. Well, on one sense, they are arbitrary. There's nothing magical about 18 years in one day that's different from 17 years and 364 days. But it also sets a line in the sand that it's unacceptable to cross. In Islam, there is no minimum age for marriage. And he's going to try to say that, that's good, because Islam doesn't just arbitrarily pick an age. Well, we decide based on the age of puberty. We'll see here shortly that that's not actually true. But even if that was true, that you set the minimum age as when a girl first menstruates, a girl who menstruates is not automatically emotionally and physically ready for sex, let alone a loving long-term relationship. So this definition is no better than an arbitrary age, and it's far too young based on normal standards of when a girl matures in modern society.
Yeah. But he says here, Islam sets the age of marriage at puberty, and that's something we'll get to in a little bit, because there's an interesting discussion around puberty within the Sharia. And then this is a very common excuse. Most societies sanctioned child marriages. It was not introduced by Islam, but regulated. It was banned by every other society if it was part of. Why is Islam still regulating it rather than banning it?
That's a good question. And even if every society on earth allowed child marriage, that wouldn't make it right. I mean, that's just really silly. He's not going to say most societies around the world allow for adulterous relationships by law and say, so therefore it's perfectly fine in Islam. Somehow it only works when it's something he wants to justify. And it only works by pointing to the past, not the present. All he can say is, well, other societies did this at some point in their history, so we're going to do it now.
Someone mentioned in the comments something I pointed very correct. It says here Aisha was 7 when she was married off, although most of the information says 6 in Islam. And she came to live with him when she reached puberty at 9, but she was still playing with dolls at 9. She had not reached puberty.
That is correct.
And then Aisha became the leading female scholar. So what does that have to do with, yeah.
Well, the first half of this number 7 here, he says, women abused as children usually have difficult times coping as adults. They're often unstable and psychologically handicapped. So it seems like he's going to say, so this is good reason why we shouldn't allow child marriage. But in fact, he's twisting it to try to use it as proof that Aisha wasn't prepubescent. Well,
sorry.
Yeah. So, problem number 1 often doesn't mean always. And problem number 2, being a scholar of Islam means that Aisha repeated a bunch of hadith, or more accurately, had a bunch of hadith attributed to her. It doesn't mean that she was emotionally stable or that she had an easy time coping as an adult or anything remotely like that.
Also, Aisha never had children, and it's known that if children are exposed to young children to vaginal sex at that age, it can actually rupture and destroy the womb. So the fact that she never had children could be because of what happened to her at that age of 9. And also, if she became a leading scholar, right, why did she say in Ihya al-Ulum by Al-Ghazali that Muhammad only pretended to be a prophet from Allah?
Good question. Yeah, she's a leading scholar, but when she says something like that, somehow it's weak.
Yeah. So this is from the Sharia. This is from the Umdat al-Salik, also known as the Reliance of the Traveler. And it actually specifically defines the age of puberty in section K 13.8. It says puberty applies to a person after the first wet dream, okay? Or upon becoming 15. 9 and 15 are the same age, right, Thaddeus?
You bet.
Yeah, that's what I always thought. I mean, that's what I always thought. Look, I've got 12 fingers on my hand. Same thing. And then this is in lunar years, right? And then it says, or when a girl has her first menstrual period. Aisha hadn't had her first menstrual period yet. Or a fourth qualification, or pregnancy. So if she's 8 and she fell pregnant, well, hey, she it's puberty. She was clearly mature because, she fell pregnant. So therefore she didn't have a menstruation yet. She never had a wet dream. She wasn't 15, but I had sex with her. You picked the age and she had a baby. So whatever. Yeah, she was. What do you think of that, Thaddeus? I think that's just immoral.
Well, yeah, I mean, the clear thing, well, I mean, there's a lot that could be said here, but one thing that we should note is that this implicitly means that you can start having sex with her before she reaches puberty, or she couldn't be getting pregnant and thus reaching puberty at that time.
So, I mean, but to justify someone having sex with a young girl who meets none of these qualifications that they provide, if she falls pregnant, then they can say, well, she was mature, obviously. But what if she doesn't fall pregnant? Then you just keep trying until she does, and then you go, yeah, see, on the 18th try, she fell pregnant. She was clearly mature.
I guess, I don't know.
I mean, this is just horrific. So, yeah, so if Muslims want to tell you about pregnancy, ask them to define, where is puberty defined? And well, here it is, wet dream, or 15, or menstruation. But yeah, I don't think that meets Western standards or even medical standards of what proper adulthood is.
Yeah, and if we're going just from a medical definition, the start of puberty is the start of adolescence. The end of puberty is when you become an adult from a medical standpoint.
Yeah, we're only legally adult at 18, and in fact, your proper adult only becomes a proper adult at about 25. That's when the brain finally forms. So, yeah.
A couple of people were pointing out about how Aisha did not complain and such, and Farouk says, I think she had Stockholm syndrome. And, that's a definite possibility that, she was basically put in a situation where she had absolutely no choice but to obey Muhammad. And over time, she developed a fondness for him because she was in a situation where that was the only coping mechanism she had available to her.
Right. So next.
Yeah, so this next difficult to explain fact is that beating your wife is permitted in Islam. And unlike most Muslims we see in the YouTube comments and whatnot, he does not try to deny this. He says flat out, Islamic law permits hitting wives. So kudos to him for being frank about what Islamic law what Islamic law allows. But then he's going to try to justify this. Point number one is that domestic violence is not unique to Muslim societies, which is quite true. However, he claims that in the West, the rate of domestic violence is higher, even though it's illegal for husbands to hit their wives. Ironically, this is going to contradict something he says later on about hand chopping. But for now, what do you think of this claim that domestic violence is not common in Muslim societies?
Well, if it's legal in Islamic societies, why would they report it?
Good point.
You know, then it's acceptable. There's acceptable levels of violence, clearly.
Yeah, and when we look at independent observers who like do a survey of the world on which countries are the worst for women's rights,
Middle Eastern countries.
or worst for violence against women or anything like that, usually like 9 out of the top 10 or 17 out of the top 20 or something like that are all Islamic countries. And I don't think that that is coincidence.
Well, of the 15 worst countries for women, actually, I'm just going to pull this over. These are the 15 worst countries for women. It's just showing up. So this is Yemen, Pakistan, Syria, Chad, Iran, Jordan, Morocco, Lebanon, Egypt, Mali, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Ivory Coast, Mauritania, and Guinea. And they're every single one an Islamic country or Islamic majority country.
So there you go, 15 out of the top 15 according to this particular survey.
Yeah, that really doesn't help their case. So he admits that Sharia says that a husband is permitted to hit his wife, and the Quran permission is given specifically in the case of a divorce as a last resort to save the marriage. So in other words, the beatings will continue until the morale improves.
Yeah, and he's kind of just making this up here. The Quran says nothing about divorce anyway. It just says if you fear disobedience, they don't even have to be disobedient. You just have to fear that they're going to be.
Yeah, in the case of rebellious and unjustly, he speaks of in the case of a rebellious and unjustly disobedient, but it simply does say where you fear it. And it says very clearly, you can use it to bring her back in line. He is allowed to hit her. Notice he doesn't seem to specify exactly. And he says here, if they disobey you. And the Quran doesn't say that. It says, if you fear disobedience.
Yeah, the law has done something pretty deceptive there. If you want to go back to that slide real quick. He mentions the Quran verse. He says, Allah stated in the Quran, gives the reference 434 there. But then without any warning, he just goes into the Prophet also said, and then he quotes a hadith, which makes it look like that's what the Quran teaches. But in fact, that is not what the Quran teaches. The Quran specifically says, if you fear disobedience, then discipline women in the following ways, including beating them.
Right. Yeah, so he's allowed to hit us. So let's see what the Quran says in this case. This is from Sahih International. Men are in charge of women. We're the feminists on that. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, advise them, forsake them in bed, and then strike them.
And I want to point out that the translator has added these words first, then, finally. In fact, it's actually just a list. There is no progression in the actual Arabic. It's just a list of things you can do. Even critics of Islam usually grant that this is a progression, but in fact, it looks like to me that the Quran actually just says these are your options. You can advise them, you can deny them sex, or you can hit them. Your choice, whichever you think is best.
Yeah. And then, so I've got 10 slides here, which I'll try not to spend too much time on, but these are authentic references from Islamic Sharia and other sources which discuss Muhammad's and his companions' treatment of women, including Aisha, his child bride. It says here, the Prophet said, a man will not be asked why he beat his wife. Do you think that's clear as mud, Thaddeus?
Yeah.
So if you beat your wife, no one's going to ask. So a man will not be asked. This is what the Prophet Muhammad said. And these are all the references here. So if you need to look at the video, these are multiple references and a link to it if you want to have a look later. So make a note of that. Then Iyas ibn Abdullah reported the message of Allah saying, "Do not beat Allah's handmaidens." But when Umar came to the messenger and said, "Women have become emboldened towards their husbands," the Prophet gave permission to beat them. So Muhammad gave permission to beat wives who become emboldened. And then the women afterwards came round to the messenger of Allah's family complaining about their husbands. So the Prophet said, women have gone round Muhammad's family complaining against their husbands. These are not the best among you. In other words, women who complain about their husbands beating them are not good women.
Ridiculous.
Do you think that's an accurate, what I've just interpreted there from that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's what the Hadith definitely says. I was just commenting on the morals of it.
Yeah, let's look at the next one. So Muhammad beats Aisha, his wife, his young child bride, his 6-year-old child bride. He struck me on the chest, which caused me pain. And he then said, "Did you think that Allah and his apostle would deal unjustly with you?" In other words, he's saying that hitting her was just. And that's Sahih Muslim, Book 4, Hadith number 2127. And do note that in many, many translations, it is translated as he nudged her on the chest, or he pushed her.
Yeah, push is the one I usually hear Muslims try to say. And, you know, whatever this action was, whether it was, you know, 2 hands shove or if it was a 1-hand slap or whatnot, the point is that it caused her pain. A nudge does not cause someone pain.
Yeah. But he called it just. He said that it was just. So next, in At-Tabari, volume 9, page 113, Allah permits you, shut them in separate rooms and to beat them. And he says, treat women well, for they are like domestic animals. Allah has made the enjoyment of their bodies lawful. Women are for sex, obviously.
Yeah, and he's saying, you know, he does say, but don't treat them too severely, just like you wouldn't treat your cattle too severely. You don't want to beat your animals, then that'll reduce their usefulness and their value. Same with your wives. You don't want to beat them too severely. That might cause them to be physically unable to give you the enjoyment of their bodies. So, you know, be careful. This is the enlightened women's rights of Islam.
Yeah, true. So it says beat them. Let's continue. Narrated Abdullah bin Zama, the Prophet said, none of you should flog or whip his wife as he flogs a slave and then have sexual intercourse with her in the last part of the day. So do not flog your wife. Do not whip your wife the way you would whip a slave and then still demand sex from her at night.
Yeah, very, very merciful. You know, the day that you beat your wife as if she was a slave, that day she's off the hook. It's funny because, you know, Muslims might quote that first half of that verse and pretend like that's the end of it. Do not flog your wife as you flog a slave. Well, even if they probably won't even do that very often, because that admits that slavery is permissible and that you can abuse your slave as much as you like. But your wife has that very slightly higher rights that when you do flog her, you got to let her off for the night.
At least your slave is spared having sex after you've beaten them with a whip. Like, yeah, that's great. And this is Sahih Bukhari. That's a Sahih Bukhari reference. Just so that you know, it's volume 7, book 62, hadith 132. Here you can see the original. Let's continue. Allah's messenger was asked about an unmarried slave girl who committed illegal sexual intercourse. They heard him saying, flog her. And if she commits illegal sexual intercourse after that, flog her again. And on the 3rd or 4th offense, sell her. Just thought I'd put that there for reference. Little fun fact. So Muhammad allowed flogging of women and slave women for that matter. And in fact, if you read some of the other versions or variants of this particular hadith, you can sell her for as little as the cost of, I don't know, you said something like a comb for your hair. So you can sell her extremely cheaply. Now we go to the, this is the Minhaj at Taliban, right? Taliban, in this chapter called Disobedience of Wives. It's page 318. At the first indication of disobedience to marital authority, a wife should be exhorted by a husband without his immediately breaking off relations with her. When she manifests disobedience through, though isolated, right, which leaves no doubt as to her intentions, right, he should repeat his exhortations, confine her to a chamber, but without striking her. He may have recourse to blows, even where disobedience is manifested by a single or an isolated act. So you can hit her, even if she does one thing out of line. Only when there are repeated acts of disobedience may a husband inflict corporal chastisement. This would mean hit her with a stick or hit her with a whip, but you can hit her with your fists if she does one thing out of line. This is a Sharia manual by Nawawi.
And really, I mean, they're getting that straight from the Quran, basically. So we can't even say that this is the sick opinion of this author. It's basically just telling you exactly what the Quran says.
Yeah, I mean, this is an authoritative Sharia manual. This is from one of the top scholars of Islam. Now let's look at the reliance of the traveler. Section M, 10.12, dealing with a rebellious wife. When a husband notices signs of rebelliousness, right, he may hit her, right? So you should keep from her without keeping from her or hitting her, for it may be that she has an excuse, right? So don't just immediately reach out and hit her, right? But you must tell her, obeying me is religiously obligatory. You have to obey me. It is obligatory religiously that you obey me, right? If she commits rebelliousness, he keeps from sleeping with her and having sex with her without words, and he may hit her, right? He may hit her whether she's rebellious only once. So on the very first occasion, he can hit her, or whether more than once, though a weaker opinion holds that he may not hit her unless there is repeated rebelliousness. So the weaker opinion says that she needs to do it many times. The stronger authoritative opinion says, if she steps out of line, beat her.
Yep, this is how you have mercy in Islam. You have the option to not hit her the first time.
Yeah, this is the most authoritative, most famous Sharia manual in the world. Let's have a look. If it is permissible, so it is permissible for him to hit her if he believes that hitting her will bring her back to the right path.
Well, there you go. All he needs to do is believe that it will work. You know, I'm sure that every committer of domestic violence in history has thought that beating their girlfriend or wife would cause her to start obeying. So according to Islam, that is perfectly legitimate behavior.
Yeah. And then the Prophet said, right? So here, there's an argument between Aisha and her father. She says something about Muhammad, and Abu Bakr gave her such a slap that blood began to ooze from her mouth, right? So Muhammad's companion beats Aisha such that blood oozes from her mouth, and Muhammad did nothing. There's more than one reference like this. There's more than one where she gets hit in Muhammad's presence and he does nothing. And then a woman came to Muhammad and begged him to stop her husband from beating her. Her skin was bruised so badly that it is described as being greener than the green veil she was wearing. Muhammad did not admonish her husband, instead ordered her to return to her husband and submit to his sexual desires. Sahih Bukhari.
Yeah, it's hard to keep commenting on these things. They're just also depraved. I mean, this removes any possible excuse of it being like discipline. Clearly, this woman has been severely beaten if her skin is changing colors. And Muhammad's like, nope, go back to your husband, fulfill his desires.
Yeah, clearly. And so that I just thought I don't know how these Muslims excuse it. They say, no, there's no such thing, but Bilal Philips is saying it. Then they'll say, well, he's a liar. okay, so he's lying to thousands, maybe millions of Muslims. I mean, yeah, but that's okay because you're wrong. You lying Thaddeus and Lloyd. Yeah. Next
Y-
one, chopping off
Yeah,
heads and hands.
we read Sahih Bukhari and we're liars. A mom tells them that nope, Islam doesn't permit that, gives no source whatsoever. They want to believe it, so that must be true. Before we go on to another issue, there was a couple comments in the chat on women's rights. Tatuanin asks, how can women in Islam get a divorce? I heard bad sex or impotency is a good enough reason, or violence against her, but is this also lies? So do you know the precise rules for when a woman is allowed to ask for a divorce?
I've read them, but it's not something I come across very often, so I cannot remember entirely. There is one circumstance where a woman can request for a divorce. I think that is if she's getting no sex from her husband. She can then file for and receive a divorce. And there may be another circumstance, but generally speaking, she's entirely at a disadvantage legally. I'd have to look at the actual references. I don't want to speak from memory and be wrong. So yeah, it is defined. The Hadaya goes into some length, and there are others as well. There are specific Sharia manuals dealing with that subject. But yeah, only if she's not getting sex, I think, for no reason, that no fault of her own, can she then do so.
Yeah, and we have to keep in mind that whatever the specified reasons are, the woman is going to have a really hard time proving those to a court if the husband tries to say they're not true, because how is she going to have 2 or 4 witnesses to testify that her husband is impotent, for example? I mean, he says he's not. It's her word against his, and who do you think they're going to believe?
Yeah,
Uh,
she is.
Goat Ate the Quran says, strangely, some women and girls in the West convert to Islam. I wonder why. And, that's really sad. And it's true that we do see people sometimes, females sometimes converting to Islam. It's often because they want to be with a specific man who happens to already be a Muslim. Um, but I would say that the primary reason why they aren't repulsed by any of these teachings that we just looked at is because, well, they don't know they exist. There's not a lot of honesty about what Islam teaches in the West. Do you have anything to add to that?
I know. I think that's fine. Also, we have a lot of slides. I don't want to spend too much time on any given one. There's a lot to get through. But no, I think that's fine.
We did have a super chat from Hindu historian. It just says hi, but thank you very much for your support. We really appreciate
Great to
that.
have you on. Thank you for coming to the show. Yeah.
Then there was a number of comments about how women are treated in Islam. They're kind of treated like cows. They're subject to mental and physical abuse, treated as a punching bag. This is revolting, and so forth. And we certainly agree with all of that. The reason we're going over this is, to inform the audience so that they can share this with Muslims. We put all the sources up on the screen. Go back, write those down, and bring them up the next time you're in a conversation where a Muslim who tries to say that Islam has great women's rights and so forth.
Yeah, we should do a show, Thaddeus, right? We've spoken about it before on women in Islam, just to collect all the evidence and present it as a single body of evidence in one show. Might be useful.
Yeah, definitely. We should definitely do that at some point. And I also like to do a show contrasting Islam and Christianity's view of women, because if they're not trying to defend this behavior, it's going to be, well, the Bible says women can't speak in church, or whatever other out of context verse they want to go to. So I'd like to, take a deep look at what the Bible teaches about women and what the Quran and Hadith teach about women, and kind of compare and contrast. So look for those things coming in the future. Should we move on to the next issue?
Yeah, I'm just trying to answer a question for Francis. I'm going to paste a link in the chat. Francis Altitude. I've just posted you the link to archive.org. to Ihya al-Ulum al-Din. That's Al-Ghazali's book, and it's now in the chat just below your comment.
It actually won't show up in the chat because links don't work unless you're a moderator. So let me make you a moderator real quick.
Thanks. Okay, then I'll repost
All
it.
right,
And
so
we'll...
you're now a moderator, so it should show up now.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. That is a link to archive.org. It will send you to the right page with the right reference, including the book from Al-Ghazali. Yeah, so topping off of hands and heads, unless there's anything more in the chat.
Nope, we can move on. So remember a little while ago, he said that domestic violence in the West is higher, even though it's illegal. Well, he's now going to try to say that theft is lower in the Middle East because of this law. So he's kind of contradicting himself here by saying that, on one hand, saying laws don't cause people to behave well, and here saying they do. But once again, to his credit, he doesn't try to deny that the Muslim law allows for people to have their hands chopped off for stealing, and also allows stoning to death for certain crimes. He says that Muslim application of criminal law is often described as medieval draconian law. The application of capital punishment has been banned by the UN and ECC. And he is quite right, of course. That is how we would describe his laws, because that is an accurate description of Islam.
I mean, they are crimes against humanity according to international law. And why do they persist in following a system that is literally revealed as a crime, legally a crime against humanity? Cruel and unusual punishment.
And of course, the reason is because the all-wise, all-merciful God, Allah, revealed these things in his sacred text. That is why they will support them, even though common sense tells us that they are inhumane.
Yeah, I find it odd that when they speak of the Sunnah, they only refer to the Hadith and always ignore the Sirah, because the Sunnah refers to both.
Mm-hmm.
The example of Muhammad is found, and in fact, the Hadith don't contain dating. The Hadith don't contain any references to dates. There's no chronology. So the Sirah is needed to place it within a chronological context. So why do they always ignore the Sirah, which is actually critical to Islam?
Mm-hmm. So we see here that punishments described by God in the revealed text of the Quran. There are 6 serious offenses, which are drinking alcohol, theft, armed robbery, illicit sex, which he seems to define as homosexuality, pedophilia, or bestiality. I think would usually include any form of adultery or extramarital sex. Sexual slander and apostasy are the 6 serious crimes. He says that, well, go ahead.
No, Islam also prioritizes punishment. It doesn't discuss rehabilitation. It really speaks of punishment and threats of punishment as the main way it deals with this.
Yes, absolutely. And he's actually, I don't know if we put that in the slide or not, but he actually kind of made fun of the idea of rehabilitation in his Dawah manual. We're not covering every single point, so we're just kind of hitting on the highlights, but he did make fun of the idea that you could rehabilitate a criminal, which is pretty interesting, that he thinks that that's impossible.
Yeah, and you cannot lighten the punishment. Crazy. You have to do exactly what Allah said, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. Cannot be pardoned. Wow.
Yep. No mercy, no looking at circumstances, nothing. It's just, you did something that Allah doesn't like, you're going to get the punishment Allah prescribes.
Yeah, and then he says that the right hand is surgically removed at the wrist, and the left foot at the ankle is removed. which is interesting, but this is a reference to Quran 533. But also, when they say surgically, you mean they take you to a surgeon? Because what happens is they take you to a chopping block in the public square and a man with a sword removes it.
Well, we could say that if the sword's really sharp, it's cut off with surgical precision. So I guess that it's surgery in Bilal's opinion.
Yeah, the guy's a medical doctor. Maybe his name is Zakir. Great. And is removed on the second occasion, but he provides no references as well. It would be interesting if he actually provided some kind of references. And on the third occasion, he may even be executed. And the law is there for deterrence. So yeah, no rehabilitation, just deterrence using violence. And then, of course, he's referencing Quran 533, that indeed the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and his messenger and strive to cause corruption. In this case, corruption, and we've covered this at length in other shows, this corruption means to lead someone away from Islam. So it's actually literally the word they use here from Islam is temptation. So it's to tempt you away from Islam to other religions. And in terms of waging war, what they mean here is to not practice Islam, but to go against Allah and to want to have another religion, is that they be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides. So this is taken from the Quran, but it's specified. He refers to it here. Any thoughts from you, Thaddeus?
Nope, I think you got that covered pretty clearly. You can't really come up with any justification for this other than Allah said so. But if we're trying to decide whether Allah is actually a just and merciful God, then we kind of need some more standard than Allah said to do it.
Yeah, and then hudud punishments, retribution is obvious from the severity. So this is retribution against you, defying Allah.
I guess.
In retaliatory punishment, there is life for you. Hey, we've taken off your hand and opposite foot, and there's life for you in that. So that you fear God. Like, okay, so God will punish you through, And he tries to quote this scholar, Goodhart said in 1953, retribution and punishment is an expression of the community's disapproval of crime. And if this retribution is not given recognition, then the disapproval may also disappear. In other words, if you don't cruelly, unjustly torture people, then people may start approving of crime. And he calls it here vengeance. So they don't do rehabilitation, they do vengeance in Islam.
Yeah, and he says that just because you're seeking vengeance doesn't make it cruel and unusual punishment. In fact, it makes the punishment intelligible. So, putting someone in jail, separating them from the people that they might harm, that's unintelligible. But chopping off someone's hand, that really makes the punishment real, apparently.
Yeah, crazy stuff. So I went to the Sharia. Right. Now, again, we go back to the reliance of the traveler. And it says in section 014, section O is the book of justice, and it says the penalty for theft. A person's right hand is amputated, whether he is a Muslim, a non-Muslim subject of the Islamic State, in other words, a dhimmi, or someone who has left Islam. So whether you're a Muslim or non-Muslim, they will chop off your hand. Right. Now, in this particular manual, it says if you steal at least a quarter of a dinar, which is 1.058 grams of gold or goods worth that much, then you may have your hand chopped off. Now, a dinar today, we don't have, so they go on to discuss dirhams, right? Dinars. So apparently 12 dirhams make one dinar, right? 12 dirhams make one dinar. 12 dirhams is in today's value $3.27 as of today. So if you steal $3, according to this manual, Well, anyway, there's different opinions, different scholarly opinions on this, right? According to other scholarly sources, now it depends which manual you check. So for $3.27, 1 dinar, they can chop off your hand and your foot. 1.058 ounces of gold as of 2 hours ago is $69.24. So it depends really on which Sharia manual they are trained in and which one they are using in your given geographical area or what judge you have.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on one of the later slides, but Bilal gives his own definition of exceptions, and his number, when I put that into a currency conversion, came to $2.74. So we can
Yeah.
see that the value of a hand is worth somewhere between $2.74 and $69.24.
And don't forget, gold is at an all-time high today. It's its highest point in history yesterday. So yeah, if gold falls, it's going to be half that value. This is insane. And now we go to the Hedaya. This is the most complete, the most thorough of the fifth manual, the Sharia manuals. It's 2,652 pages. Now, I have not read every single one, but I've read several hundred of these in sections that interest me. And they speak here, starting on page 82, they speak of thefts which require amputation, and it goes up to page 126, right? So here you can get over 40 pages of information about cutting off people's hands. In this case, from page 82 to 98, you've got 16 pages of slicing off of people's hands. Of course, it goes into 107 on the manner of cutting off of the limb. So yeah, you got 40-something pages of slicing off limbs in the Sharia. Right, let's continue. So they speak here of concerning the amount of the value, there are various opinions. Okay, the argument of Malik and Shafi, and these are the founders of the Shafi and Maliki school of jurisprudence, right, of fiqh in Islam, is that in the time of the Prophet, amputation was inflicted for the theft of any article of the value of a shield. Now, the lowest value of a shield is 3 dirhams. So 3 dirhams is less than $1. It's 80 US cents. Okay. So yeah. So in other words, you could steal US cents worth of goods and have a limb amputated. Does that? Yeah. So there we go. Different number, Thaddeus.
Yep. So, there's some variation on the exact minimum dollar of property, but even if we go with the highest value with gold at an all-time high, it's like $70. That's like not even remotely a serious crime in any reasonable society, in my opinion. In the United States, felony theft is something like $2,000 minimum or something. Anything less than that is a misdemeanor. There's still a penalty, but it's much less severe than jail time. I know that in my particular state, when I last worked at a retail store, I know this because the security guards told us in the introduction that if you're caught shoplifting, the penalty is like 3 times the value of the goods, or a minimum of $300. So you steal a candy bar worth $1, that's a $300 fine. You steal, something worth 100, or let's say $200, it's a $600 fine. But as long as you're not reaching that felony level, it's just a fine. And of course, it goes on your record, and if you continue to steal, then the penalties get more severe. But the point here is that Islam has no differentiation. You steal something worth $5, you steal something worth $50,000, it's exactly the same crime, which is kind of defying common sense. Our friend, inspired by Sheikh Ahmed Didat, is in the chat today.
He said, this is our opinions.
Well, first he says, yes, that's the punishment, thumbs up. So he's approving of hand chopping. And then you're right, he did say that that's just your opinion. You can't prove that Islam is false. So I want you to put in the chat that you agree with Islam, that it's completely just for chopping off someone's hand for stealing something that costs $3. And I want you to say those exact words, or else you are just giving us your opinion and not supporting what Sharia law actually states.
your opinion can't disprove Islam, just so you know. I can see a lot, only give your opinions. We're reading from your top Sharia manuals from your best scholars, but yeah, it's our opinions. That is insane. This guy is like lost, seriously lost. I'm not ashamed of the Islamic law, so I have nothing to apologize for. So Didat, so you are going to happily beat your wife because Sharia law allows it, Allah allows it, and Muhammad beat his wife. So yeah, that's great. I'm sure your wife's really, really excited about that. That's great. Something to look forward to. Hopefully you'll have good medical care.
All right. So he did say, if that's the law, presumably referring to my $3 comment, then I totally agree. So there you go. He doesn't want to use his own brain to decide whether something's just or not. He's just going to do it because someone told him that Allah wants it that way, and that's that. For everyone else, for the other 99.9% of the world who actually want to use their brain, they will look at this and reach the same conclusion that we are, that it is insane to cut someone's hands
Didat
off.
just said that he never hit her, and she said it herself. We just read. We should do a show on this. He never hit her. She said it herself. He actually blatantly will lie in the face of the evidence from Aisha herself, from Islamic text. Crazy.
To his credit, he probably wasn't in the chat yet when we read that. So maybe he just is ignorant of his sources as usual, and we'll have to educate him. And then tomorrow he'll come back and be like, of course you're allowed to beat your wife in Islam. I know that, and I support it 100%.
Yeah. Aisha was beaten so that blood came out of her mouth, and inspirational. So basically they speak of there's no amputation for less than a dinar or less than 10 dirhams, which is roughly $3, right? Just under $3 or whatever. And this is the most approved doctrine. So when you get more than $3, the story is that you need to have. Now, I'll bet you, inspired at some point in his career as a human being, actually probably stole something from a store from someone. I think all of us growing up have done stupid things. So by this law, he needs to be amputated because he can't tell me he's never done something stupid in his childhood. I mean, he's still a child, but, Yeah, so moving on. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Final point.
This is good when we have a Muslim in the chat who's willing to try to defend the thing that we're talking about.
DCACI has been denied live streaming. Good grief. Wow. So the slave and the free man with respect to amputation are upon an equal footing. So punishment is inflicted equally upon the free man and the slave. The limb of a slave, therefore, is to be struck off in the same manner as that of a freeman, which means, and this tells us, because 70% of the Hidayah, if you read the introduction to the Hidayah, it says that 70% of the Sharia is about slavery. 70% of the content of the Sharia is all about slavery. So slavery is still legal in Islam. And Inspired, how many slaves will you own once the caliphate is formed? You're planning to, how many slaves are you going to have? How many women sex slaves are you going to have? And it says here, it would appear that the value of the dirham is from 8 pennies to 9 pence sterling. So we no longer have pounds sterling, right? But upon this calculation, the value of theft to induce amputation must be at least 6 and 8 pence sterling, right? Mm-hmm. So now here we're talking about less than $1. So yeah, now we're talking about less than $1. Steal less than $1 worth of goods and have your arm or your leg chopped off. Fascinating stuff. So
Inspired admitted that slavery is legal, but says that the Islamic concept of slavery is different. Different in what way? I mean, you own the person; you have complete rights over them. Maybe you captured them from Africa and brought them to a different land, or maybe you didn't. Maybe they aren't from Africa, but that's the only difference that I can think of. And of course, Muhammad himself owned multiple Black African slaves, and he traded 2 Black African slaves for 1 white slave. So apparently white slaves, while allowed, were more valuable than the Black slaves.
Yeah, they were worth at least twice that. But also, why is he giving us an opinion? we can go, the Hidayah has hundreds of pages dedicated to discussing slaves, slavery, how slaves are property, how they are to be sold, etc. The punishment of slaves, because they say here, hey, by all means, chop off the limbs of your slaves. So how is it different? Give us Sharia references, not just your opinion, because A, you're ignorant, and B, you're a liar. We know this already, right? So give us the actual references. This is the most detailed Sharia manual that your scholars study. They start with different manuals. This is the final one that the scholars study because it's the most detailed. So give us the name of the Sharia manual you are referring to, Dida. Come on, do it. Yeah, moving on. I'll let you go with the start of this again.
Yep. The slide hasn't popped up yet on my end.
Oh, okay. So
okay, there. Okay, it has now. Sometimes there's a delay, sometimes it's instant. I don't know why. Anyway, so the next thing that he wants to talk about is Muslims' opinion about personal freedoms, including sexual freedoms. So he says, adultery and fornication have been decriminalized in the West due to the rapidly changing moral standards. Well, first of all, that is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't really matter what the Western opinion is. We're talking about what's right here. As usual, he wants to distract by the West. And second of all, it's not really true. I know of very few, if any, countries that had laws against adultery, at least that have severe punishments. There might be a law such that if someone commits adultery, then their spouse is allowed to divorce them, which is in some sense a law against adultery. But I don't recall any Western country or otherwise ever having a law that if someone was caught in adultery, they were stoned to death. So then he tries to give some excuses, saying that laws are based on morality and that the Western principle of morality has changed, so that's why the laws are changing. However, it's different in Islam apparently, because Islam holds that adultery and fornication are crimes against society when they become public knowledge. And how did they become public knowledge exactly? Oh, right, because the state is spying on everything you do. And then he goes on to say that, it's really not that bad because proof of guilt is limited to a few conditions: pregnancy, confession, or the testimony of 4 adult Muslim eyewitnesses to the act. So basically, in practicality, no one's going to be coming to confess. You're probably not going to be having sex in front of 4 other adults. So basically, it's limited to pregnancy. In other words, only women can be convicted of these crimes. And it actually doesn't matter whether it was consensual sex at all. If a woman is found pregnant and she's not married, then she's in big trouble because that is apparently proof of guilt that she committed adultery or fornication.
Sorry, I'm just chatting with Didat.
Yeah, I see
also,
that.
something, the issue with the testimony of 4 adult Muslim eyewitnesses. When I lived in Dubai, for instance, there was a case where a woman went to the police. I mean, there are multiple cases like this. There are numerous, but a tourist was raped by someone at a hotel, and she went to the police. And of course, because she couldn't provide 4 eyewitnesses to support the contention that she was raped, because there was proof that she had sex, because they did a swab to determine that she had DNA evidence inside of her, and of course, she went to jail. So this is not an uncommon, this is a very common thing. So this is insane. I mean, how do you prove your innocence? How do you prove that you were raped? And
So Dida is trying to claim that Muhammad never hit Aisha, and he is citing Sahih Muslim. I'll go ahead and read that hadith here. Aisha reported that Allah's messenger never beat anyone with his hand, neither a woman nor a servant, but only in the case when he had been fighting in the cause of Allah, and he never took revenge for anything unless the things made inviolable by Allah were made viable, and he never took revenge for Allah, the exalted and glorious. So you kind of you're claiming this says he never hit anyone, but you missed the except cause there. So he never hit anyone except when he was fighting in the cause of Allah. And he never took a revenge against anyone except when he took revenge against things that Allah had made illegal. So in other words, the hadith is perfectly consistent with him hitting Aisha when she did something wrong. He never hit anyone unless they did something wrong. Aisha did something wrong, he hit her. You have failed to prove your case. And additionally, even if it said they had never hit anyone, how do you know that this wasn't written before he hit Aisha? Are you saying that this one is Aisha saying something true and the other is her saying something false? Why would she make up being hit, but make up being hit and truthfully say that he had never hit anyone?
Yeah.
Or likely
Well,
the other way around.
of course, he's quoting a partial hadith. And
yeah, I was going to say, but another possibility is simply that at some point in early on, say when she was 10, he hadn't hit her, and she reported that she'd never seen him hit anyone. And then he hit her when she was 12, and she reported that he hit her. I mean, they don't contradict each other any way you look at it. So you have no excuse whatsoever for ignoring.
Says he never hit anyone unless he had a reason.
Yep, exactly.
So if he had a reason, then he would hit them. It doesn't say he never hit anyone. It says he didn't hit them unless he had a reason to do so, according to Islamic law.
So good try,
misquoting the hadith.
Good try, but you failed. Come back to us after you've read the other hadith where he hit Aisha, and tell us again how that one's been mistranslated. He didn't strike her and cause her pain. He pushed her and caused her pain. He didn't strike anyone. He only pushed them. He didn't punch anyone in the face. He only slapped them in the face, or whatever other excuse you want to make. It's all word games. He clearly did something that we would consider abuse to Aisha.
And he says that it's all about fighting and warfare, but he talks about here, there's revenge. He never took revenge for anything unless the things were made inviolable by Allah, were made violable. And also don't forget that the punishment, the had punishments, the hudud that they speak of, are considered revenge. So punishment in Islam is considered revenge. So yeah, Muhammad did take revenge.
And now Inspired is claiming that I misquoted the hadith. Well, if that's the case, then you need to contact sunnah.com, because all I did is read it word for word there. So apparently sunnah.com is lying to all the Muslims in the world about what this hadith says, and you alone know it says something else.
It's just his opinion. But moving on, so besides, why is Bilal Philips saying that, yes, in Islam, you're allowed to hit your wife? Bilal Philips openly says it. So obviously Inspired, he outranks Bilal Philips. He's clearly a greater scholar than one of Islam's top scholars, Bilal. But so Bilal obviously is lying to how many millions of Muslims? Why aren't you talking to Bilal? Is, Inspired? Why aren't you telling Sunnah.com? Why aren't you telling Islam QA that they're lying to 400 million Muslims a month? This is scary. You have the truth. You have the answer. You need to go and tell them. But yeah, so the goal of such punishments is the protection of the family structure, right? And in fact, once adultery and fornication became decriminalized in the 60s, wife-swapping parties and orgies became countrywide rages. Since that period, such practices have entered mainstream behavior at parties and no longer cause any surprise. So apparently, I've never been to such a party. I'd love to know how often these things are supposed to be happening because, but this is the opinion of Bilal Philips.
Yeah, he does this a lot. He has these really bizarre and grotesque pictures of the West. We saw it in a previous one where he claimed that he went to a church, didn't know what they taught, and it turned out to be a gay organization, which he brought up that story for apparently no reason other than to give the subtle impression that there are gay Christian churches out there. This time he's saying, well, there's wife swapping parties and orgies going on all around the country. Everyone does these things in the West. And it's like, no, you're just making stuff up.
He says that the Bible specifically allows cutting off your wife's arm. But the Bible is a legal book that I wasn't aware of that. But yeah, fine. Yeah, so Bilal makes lots of these slanderous statements. But notice that, of course, we have from At-Tabari in the Last Years of the Prophet, volume 9, page 139, in terms of, it does tell us that Muhammad, the Prophet, is a womanizer. So just out of interest. So this woman gives herself in marriage to Muhammad, and then when she tells people that he had married her, her family says, "What a bad thing you have done. You are a self-respecting woman, but the Prophet is a womanizer. Get an annulment." She went back and asked him to revoke the marriage, and he complied. So this is Muhammad's view of women. This is what people thought of Muhammad and women, that he was a womanizer. So if Muhammad is a womanizer, how is there this idea of Islam is entirely, just you got to comport yourself with women and so on, but he was a womanizer. He is the example for all Muslims. And it says here, Muhammad's a womanizer.
And Didat's still trying to push this mistranslation thing. And all I'm going to say is, if all these faithful Muslims are mistranslating the sacred Muslim texts and the scholars are agreeing with our interpretation, then you have a lot bigger problems on your hand than us talking about them. Apparently, Muslims around the world who go to school for years to learn the core teachings of Islam so they can teach them to others are all being lied to and taught untrue things. And we're the evil people for repeating those things.
Yeah, yes, the same old excuses. The same old excuses. He'll just continue lying. So yeah. Homosexuality.
So
yeah, so the next is homosexuality. And this includes lesbianism, of course, and any kind of sexual deviance as Islam defines it.
So he doesn't have a lot to say of interest to say on this issue. Fundamentally, we agree that homosexual acts are wrong, but then his excuses or attempts to justify are in a couple cases pretty bizarre. His fourth point here, it should be noted that Islam in its final form did not introduce anti-gay legislature to the world. Once again, what does he care if it existed before or not? If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. What other societies did is totally irrelevant. And then he says that the texts of the Torah are replete with clear condemnation of such practices. That is correct. However, I do not recall any Christian or a Jewish country that decided that we should throw homosexuals off the top of the tallest building just because of these acts. And then on his sixth point here, he says that Islam considers homosexuality to be the result of a choice. It is inconceivable that God made people homosexuals, then declared it a crime. That's very interesting because, let's apply that logic to women. It's inconceivable that God created people women and then gave them less rights just because they are women. Exact same logic, somehow that doesn't seem to work. And it's also funny that, Islam considers homosexuality the result of the choice. I mean, who cares what the actual medical and scientific evidence says? Islam considers it that way, so it must be true. We don't need to look at any evidence. That's just the way it must be. But then building on this idea, he goes into some really, he kind of almost contradicts himself because he says, that God wouldn't have done this so clearly it's people's free choice. But then he says, well, humans can have inclinations from all kinds of natural and non-natural things. And these indications inclinations may come from jinn or media or human whispering or direct contact. So in the end, he's kind of saying, you know, maybe they really don't have a choice. Maybe people really are inclined towards homosexual acts, but you know, it's not all its fault. It's those jinn that apparently are more powerful than Allah.
Yeah, yeah. And Inspired agrees that they should be thrown from buildings for their actions. That homosexuals need to be killed, murdered for being homosexuals, as he states in the comments.
Yeah, and you know that, well, you know, he doesn't have a lot of a choice. That's what Islam teaches, and he just wants to hear and obey whatever Islam teaches. So if it said that uh, whatever nationality he happens to be, if everyone born of that nationality had to be killed, he'd say, yep, I agree. That's what Islam teaches. I'm not allowed to think for myself. Islam doesn't allow me to think, so I just got to support it.
Yeah.
And
yeah, and then
go ahead.
I was going to read that. So Islam instructs parents to separate their children in their beds by the age of 10 in order to avoid sexual experiences which may result from childhood experimentation. And these experiences may be reinforced in contact in school and through abuse from adults. Also, the distinction between male and female. Now, I can understand abuse from adults, which can influence young children. I mean, that's understandable. I think that is a solid basis within the scientific literature. But this is weird. Your thoughts, Danny?
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of saying that, well, maybe he's not explicitly saying it. He's strongly implying that the reason that there are people who have homosexual tendencies is because their parents allowed them to sleep in the same room or the same bed as a sibling of the same sex. And he's saying that, you know, children are going to experiment with their siblings sexually. And that's just the weirdest, most sick thing that he says, perhaps in the entire manual. You know, unless he's saying something about his own childhood, where the hell is he getting this from?
And
How
then
many people have experimented with their siblings, same sex or otherwise, sexually? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And then you have to wonder about the phenomenon of bachabazi in places like Pakistan, where they encourage young boys to feminize themselves, and that's illegal in Islam. And then, of course, we know what they do with them. So how is that acceptable, where they actually groom young boys to become feminized and to become sex objects? And this is supposedly a sin in Islam.
Yeah, I don't know. It just one inconsistency after another. Bilal's method seems to be the same method we see in the chat, YouTube chat and YouTube comments. Just throw out a bunch of things. Doesn't matter if they contradict one another. Doesn't matter if they support Islam in any real way. Just say a bunch of stuff, claim you've refuted the critics, thump your chest, and you won.
Yeah, no. Okay, so moving on. So going to the Sharia, again, going to the most famous Sharia manual in the world, one that Didat refuses, is too ashamed of, is too cowardly, is too ignorant of, or is desperately trying to hide from us, refuses to quote. We have here the penalty for fornication or sodomy, and this applies, if you read through the earlier sections, applies to lesbianism and any other similar types of actions. The legal penalty is obligatorily imposed upon anyone who fornicates or commits sodomy, right? No matter whether the person is a Muslim, a non-Muslim subject of the Islamic State, or someone who has left Islam. He or she is stoned to death. And the stoning to death is defined in section 012.6, right? And if the offender, it says here, is not someone with the capacity to remain chaste, then they are scourged 100 stripes. So they are beaten with a stick across their back 100 times or whipped 100 times, which does kill people. It must be noted, people die from this. And they are then banished to a distance of at least 50 miles or 81 kilometers for 1 year. And if the penalty is stoning, if they decide to stone you to death, the offender is stoned even in severe heat or cold, even if he has an illness from which he is expected to recover a pregnant woman is not stoned until she gives birth, and the child can suffice with the milk of another woman.
Well, there you go.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's pretty black and white here. The Bilal kind of dances around the issue, inspired by D-Dot's not trying to dance around the issue. But I think when we look at the Sharia, it's absolutely clear that Islam says that you can be stoned to death, or in other opinions, you can be thrown off a building simply for having a private sexual act in your own home with a person who Allah doesn't want you to have sex with. And certainly we're not saying that these things are moral, but there's a difference between what is moral and what needs to be punished by society. We all commit many immoral acts every day. We don't all commit homosexuality, but we do all commit immoral acts of one form or another. And if the state is going around punishing everyone for everything they did, putting them to death, then we'll all be put to death and we'll never have a chance to repent from our sinful ways and go a different path.
Yeah. Yeah, this is horrific. I mean, this is just horrific. Beating, whipping, stoning, amputating, crimes against humanity, incredible punishments. So Didat says he believes everything in the Sharia. He is proud of everything in the Sharia. So Didat, the Sharia allows men to beat their wives. The Sharia explicitly allows men to hit their wives with their fists and with sticks and belts and whips. So are you proud of that?
Yeah, the only restriction was that you can't hit them hard enough to break their bones or cause them to bleed.
He's proud of every single thing.
There you
so
go.
Is
why
your
were you
wife
denying it earlier?
so inspired? Is your wife proud that you beat her, that you hit her with your fists? Is she proud that you're a good Muslim following the Sharia so closely? The example, don't forget, the Sharia is the example of Muhammad. It's the Sunnah, right? The Sharia is drawn directly from the Sunnah, right? So from Muhammad's actions, from the law of Allah. So yeah, so Allah and Muhammad are wife beaters. So yeah, apostasy. So next we talk about apostasy. And it says, no religious freedom. Those who leave Islam are executed. So this is the difficult question. And Bilal tells us, objection to Islam is often raised against the death penalty prescribed for apostasy or abandonment of Islam, since religion in Western civilization came to be looked at as a personal choice, which cannot be enforced by either the church or the state. To execute a person for his religion would seem extreme. But Islam is not merely a religion, but a complete system of life. Well, if you continue, Thaddeus.
Yeah. So, I mean, once again, to his credit, he doesn't try to deny that this is a part of Islam. He just makes this statement that, Islam controls every aspect of your life, that Islam is everything. So, of course, you get punished for defying Islam, because that's defying your way of life. And ironically, you can kind of see an element of him understanding that it's not really a person's choice, according to Islam, what religion they follow. The Quran makes it quite clear, most Muslims don't realize it, but the Quran makes it quite clear that Allah just decides some people are going to be Muslims and decides other people aren't going to be Muslims. And then he punishes those who he makes not be Muslims, and he punishes anyone who decides they don't want to be a Muslim. So all it makes all this happen. It's not a personal choice. You don't have any choice whether you want to be a Muslim or not, and therefore it's perfectly okay to execute someone for leaving Islam, because I guess they didn't really have a choice in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Logic there.
So he says that anyone may join Islam, but it should not be taken lightly. Only those who are serious should join. But Muslims always tell us that In fact, I mean, the Sharia, when you read it, it actually states everyone must be converted. Everybody on earth must be forced to become a Muslim. So, and the death penalty discourages those who might think to join the religion in order to undermine it from within. So the apostasy law was first instituted to stop the undermining of the state. In other words, Islam is a political system.
Yeah, you know, this statement's really interesting here, that the death penalty discourages those who think to join the religion in order to undermine it from within. You know, I've never encountered anyone in my life who was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pretend to convert to Islam, or pretend to be an atheist, or pretend to convert to Christianity, or whatever, so that I will have some credibility when I say that the religion is crap. I'm pretty sure as soon as you started saying that, everyone would be like, you're obviously not really following that religion. Why are you pretending? So this is just the most ridiculous idea that I've heard. And apparently Bilal thinks it's a good reason why the death penalty has to be there, because, you know, all those people who, when the Dawahist comes up to them and gives them a bunch of lies about Islam and says, all you have to do to convert is say this Shahada, why don't you want to join this great religion? And then they say it, well, you know, because there's the death penalty they don't know exists, that made them take that choice much more seriously. I mean, come on now, let's get real.
You know, and he says the death penalty is for apostates who cooperate with enemies at war. No, it's not. He provides no evidence for that. Or for those who gather people against Islam and fight against the state. No, there is no evidence for that. He doesn't tell us where to look. And the Sharia makes it explicit that this is absolutely not the case, right? Western civilization executes its citizens for giving away state secrets, right? For treason. But Islamic law prescribes the death penalty for something far more serious. Yeah, leaving Islam. So rebellion against God is a far greater crime than rebellion against state secrets. In other words, it is treason, Islam's political system, and the Ummah is a single nation it's a country with laws. Islam's a legal political system.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because, you know, if I sell state secrets, I could be putting millions of lives in danger potentially. You know, if I sell them to someone who wants my country dead. How is leaving Islam remotely equivalent to that? Are you saying that
Selling secrets.
Yeah, the mere fact that you left Islam means that you're going to reveal all the secret teachings about Islam that you don't want that Muslims don't want anyone to know about? I mean, I don't know. You tell me how these two relate.
That just doesn't make sense. I mean, he's lying though, because let's have a look at what the Sharia says, and we can see that Bilal Philips is just lying to us and lying to fellow Muslims. Amazing. He's lying to his flock. Apostasy from Islam, ridda, leaving Islam is the ugliest form of unbelief or kufr, and it is the worst. It may even come about through sarcasm, right? So there are millions of ways of leaving Islam. But when a person who has reached puberty and is sane voluntarily apostatizes from Islam, he deserves to be killed. That is the ruling. It says nothing about cooperating with enemies of war. Nothing. Right? So I'll read that again. When a person who has reached puberty apostatizes from Islam, he deserves to be killed. So in other words, if you're 12, yeah, they'll kill you. Right? Let's have a look. It says in such a case, did I skip something? No. In such a case, it is obligatory. Now the Reliance of the Traveler is a summary of the best of the Sharia of the four schools, right? And this does give us sometimes more than one opinion. So it tells us there are different opinions. This is one of them. In such a case, it is obligatory for the caliph or his representative to ask him to repent and return to Islam. If he does, it is accepted. If he refuses, he is immediately killed. Now, other scholars will tell you there is no repentance. He is just killed immediately. No discussion, right? So this is one opinion only, right? Now, it also tells us in section 8.4, there is no indemnity for killing an apostate. It is killing, since it is killing someone who deserves to die. So there we go. It says nothing about, warfare. I'd like to see that reference. I mean, there's nothing about warfare. It just says, no, he's left Islam. He is killed. It's because Islam, when you say the Shahada, you are doing what's called bay'ah. It's a contract. It's a verbal contract. Technically, we would say it, and I believe in Christianity, we would say that it's selling your soul. At least in Western culture, we'd say this is selling your soul to Allah. You have sold yourself, and if you break the contract, the penalty for breaking the contract is death. And bay'ah is defined in the Sharia as commerce, trading. It's commercial. It's an act of sale. So you are literally selling yourself to Allah. You're not forming a relationship. You are selling yourself, like selling your soul. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you nailed it there, that when you become a Muslim, Allah owns you. You're his slave. So I guess, in a sense, when you leave Islam, you're stealing from Allah. You're denying him his slave.
Yeah, crazy stuff. And then the final one is he speaks of jihad. Are there any questions from the comments? Any questions that we need to address? Anything they want to discuss? Or
No, there's just most of the chatter recently has been about DCCI apparently being blocked from live streams. Possibly Christian Prince was also blocked. It was unclear if that was what they were saying, but this happens when you get a strike either for violating the community guidelines. It could be a copyright issue, but most likely not in this case. It's most like, it could be a false copyright issue, but most likely it's a case where enough Muslims complained about some video and YouTube decided that it crossed the invisible line that they don't tell us what it is. And thus DCCI is probably blocked from streaming for the next week. There was a request to pray about that after the stream is over, and I will definitely do that.
yeah, that's really sad. I mean, they do great work on all these channels. I mean, people do great work. And someone mentioned that, yeah, we're being lied to. Islam is always false. And it's interesting that Muslims tell us there's no law to kill in apostasy all the time. I mean, this is the Sharia. So just to be sure that I'm using the most famous, the most common, the most referred to, the most used Sharia manual in the world, right? It's called the Reliance of the Travel, also known as the Umdat al-Salik. The other references I used was from the Hadaya, right, of Marghanani. Now, there are multiple of these Sharia, there used to be thousands. And what happens is they've all been merged into, the common rulings have been merged. A handful have ultimately emerged as the authoritative ones. Each of the schools of fiqh, or the schools of jurisprudence or law, so of Islamic law, have their own, but they do refer to each other. They certainly reference each other all the time. And certain schools specialize in a certain area, so not one necessarily covers everything. Certain scholars have become specialists in a given area, so they are the ones who are referred to, and not everything is necessarily in the Sharia. They will refer to a tafsir of another scholar. That happens. So these are the most important of the Sharia manuals that I'm using. The Marghanani's Hidayah is the final manual that Islamic imams, when they go to university for 5 or 7 years, whatever it is they do to study, the Hidayah is the final manual that they study from. It's the most complete, the most thorough, the most detailed. So these are the two most powerful of these sources for this. And notice that Muslims, junior Muslims, low-level Muslims like Didat, I put him in timeout for 5 minutes, he's not allowed to discuss the Sharia. They're not allowed to. The Sharia actually very clearly states they're not allowed to share the Sharia. So he'll give all sorts of excuses. He'll say lots of things, but they're literally not allowed to share the Sharia with anyone, or anything of Islam, in fact, with anyone who's going to use it for a wrong purpose, right? So we're here to critique it. They're not allowed to share it. They can do it with a fellow Muslim or someone who wants to convert, but also they're not allowed to study it, which is because it would bring them to doubt. But because we are using Islam for this knowledge for the wrong purpose, they are not allowed to share any of it with us. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And you'd think that if the Muslim leaders and whatnot actually believed that they had truth on their side, they'd want everyone to know about it. I've never heard a a high-level Christian scholar, high-level Christian preacher, be like, this knowledge is only for those special Christians who can handle it. If we gave this information to the masses, they would apostatize in great numbers. So we got to keep this secret. But we see this all the time in Islam, that Islam is based on keeping people ignorant and telling them lies, give them a bunch of feel-good lies and hope they never find out the truth, basically. And then when someone has the audacity to read to them their own sources, the Muslims who have been lied to their entire lives come on here and like, why are you making up all these lies about Islam? We don't believe any of that stuff. It's like, I'm just reading your sources word for word. Well, those are fake sources. You misread it. You mistranslated it. And it's like, no, I was just reading it. That's literally all I was doing.
Yeah. And we're seeing that Bilal, as a famous imam himself, is lying to his flock.
Yeah, it's a combination. Distraction, excuses, half-truths, and outright lies. So, he put the little truth in there. He puts more truth in there than most have probably heard from their local imam, but at the same time, he's hiding other things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's incredible. Yeah, so the final section he brings up is holy war, right? Jihad. And he says the state of Israel is the most recent example of establishment of a state by terrorism. It was established by Greek terrorist groups, the most infamous of which was the Stern Gang. So just the levels of Jew hatred in Islam are demonstrated here for us. And I mean, this is incredibly historically inaccurate, to put it very mildly.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the primary reason that the state of Israel was created is because the West had immense guilt over the way Nazi Germany treated Jewish people, and they wanted to do something to make up for the mass extermination of Jews. So they took some of the land that at the time was colonial land that was owned by European nations, and they gave it to Israel to establish a Jewish state.
Yeah, but I mean, although we've done this in previous shows, but Islam requires, jihad requires that Muslims murder every single Jew. So he says here that the term Muslim terrorist is used to label Islam as a terrorist religion. However, it is a misnomer. And he says when IRA bombers struck, they were not labeled as Catholic terrorists, even though the struggle is between Catholic Ireland and Protestant Northern Ireland. The IRA was also fighting the British. They wanted independence from Britain. He forgets that little part. Likewise, when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in April 1995, killing 168 people, he was not labeled as a Christian terrorist, though he was Christian and a terrorist. Of course, Bilal lies here because Timothy McVeigh became a Christian 2 years after committing this crime in prison. So that might explain it, Bilal. And, you might, you tell me. And in fact, the Muslim terrorist label was attached to the activities of the PLO, who were a mixture of Muslims, Christians, and communists. The PLO is not, nor was it ever, a Muslim organization. It's a nationalist organization working for the establishment of a secular Palestinian state. Well, Palestine is like Iran. It is what do you call them? It's a theocracy.
Yeah, I've never heard in any of them any manifestos about the Palestinian state, how we just want a secular country. That's all we want. Because, Israel pretty much is a secular country already. So why do they need their own secular country? Instead, they say things like, it's our divine right to control the city of Jerusalem because Allah gave that to the Muslims. That doesn't really sound like a secular state with a secular goal to me. And this whole thing is just so silly because, well, first of all, he says, that the IRA is not labeled as Catholic terrorists. Well, actually, they often are labeled as Catholic terrorists. So that's just nonsense. And then he says, Timothy McVeigh, well, whether he was called himself a Christian or not, he certainly didn't commit his crime to further the causes of Christianity. And as Lloyd pointed out, he didn't even call himself a Christian. So, Bilal's just assuming, oh, this guy committed a terrorist act. He's white. He lives in the West. He must be a Christian. Therefore, he must have been a Christian terrorist. And the reason we call people who commit acts of terrorism in the name of Islam Muslim terrorists is because they're people trying to use terror to advance Islam. It's not because they're people who commit crimes who happen to be Muslims. We don't say, when a Muslim, say, commits a murder that's, just motivated by a domestic situation or, something like that, and it's just a quote unquote ordinary murder, we don't call them a Muslim murderer. We just call them a murderer. It's only when someone's trying to use terror to advance Islam that we call them a Muslim terrorist.
Well, and what's interesting is this should have come up by now, but if you look at the Hamas charter, and I don't know why he doesn't bring up Hamas, right? The covenant of Hamas, Hamas's formal name, and these are the people in Palestine, the last I checked, is the Islamic resistance movement. That is their formal correct name. Hamas, the proper name is the Islamic resistance movement. And let's see the very first sentence: in the name of Allah, the merciful and the compassionate. Right? You are the best nation. They start with a Quran verse, right? That, they start with Allah is going to kill people and people are bad and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam abolishes it. Islam, that's, what? So Islam has an obligation to kill the Jews, right? And the Islamic word, blah, blah. So let's see, this looks, praise be to Allah, we seek help from him. So yeah, the Islamic resistance movement. I don't know why Bilal forgot that little part about and if you read through the actual charter of Hamas, it's some fascinating reading.
Obviously, they're just a secular government looking to divide up the secular state of Israel into two different secular states, clearly. I don't know where you're getting all this idea that has anything to do with Islam.
Yeah, they claim to be the best Muslims. They've studied the Quran, they've studied the Sunnah, and they have the best understanding, the correct interpretation. In their charter states they have the best. And they even mention utilizing some form of magic. I'd have to read the actual entry, but yeah, they speak of it as... So yeah, Bilal just skipped over that portion for whatever reason. So no, the government of Palestine is entirely theocratic. Yeah. So this is our last series of slides as we wind down.
Yep. So then he makes this point that Islam opposes any form of indiscriminate violence. The Quran says anyone who has killed another except in retaliation, it is as if he killed the whole of humankind. So there's a couple things to point out here. One is that Bilal gives the wrong verse reference, which is very interesting. This is a great scholar of Islam.
Should be 532.
Yeah, presumably he proofread this document and presumably he knows the correct verse. I don't know if he somehow missed this or he's trying to prevent people from looking it up. But if you do look it up, you will see that what the Quran actually states is, for the children of Israel, we said, anyone who killed another, blah, blah, blah. But for you guys, I give this other command. So it's pretty hilarious that he's trying to use this to say that Islam prevents indiscriminate violence. And of course, sorry, I was going to say, and of course, he can say with a straight face, Islam opposes any form of indiscriminate violence, because according to Islam, it's not indiscriminate when you attack someone who's not a Muslim. You're doing it for a good reason. They're not a Muslim.
Yeah. Deedot hasn't come back into the channel. There was a complaint from one of the users that he was causing disruption. So I put him in timeout for 5 minutes. He hasn't come back. I didn't intend to silence him permanently. But yeah, this should be Quran 532. On that account, we ordained for the children of Israel, for the Jews, that if what, so hold on, but Muhammad's saying that the Jews owned Israel. That's fascinating. what are the Muslims saying today? That the Jews don't belong in Israel? That's odd. Allah seems to contradict them here. Right? We ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless for murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And this is, oddly enough, it's actually something from the Talmud. They're actually quoting something from the Talmud. And so I don't know why he misquotes that as well. But that's a discussion for another longer discussion for another time.
And IM said that 533 cancels 532, and that's kind of what I was alluding to. That he goes on.
Yes.
He goes on to say, but this was just the past law. We now have a new law. But even if it wasn't abrogated, which it still wouldn't mean much, because it says except for making or for murder or for making mischief in the land, and of course, just about anything can be considered making mischief in the land. So Islam, it's not indiscriminate, it's just justified by Allah for
I'll get to that from the Sharia, because that's going to be a fascinating section to see. And he says there is no term in Arabic which means holy war. War is not holy in Islam. These are the just or unjust, and that is absolutely not true. He's just making that up. And but he says here, of course, if women, children, or the elderly bear arms, they may be killed. What if they're bearing arms to protect themselves from those Muslims that were killing their men? And they picked up arms to protect themselves. Well, okay, they want to protect themselves from us. Let's kill them for that. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, he says in self-defense, but again, this is one of those word games, because as far as Islam's concerned, all non-Muslims are perpetually at war with Muslims. So they're automatically in a state of aggression against Islam just for existing. So there really is no such thing as self-defense.
Yeah. Andrew just mentioned from the Mishnah Sanhedrin. That is correct. Yeah, it is. We did a talk on that some time ago. I just don't have the reference in front of me now to bring it up. We did some detailed discussion of that in the past. Thank you. So he speaks of, now this is the literal colloquial meaning of jihad, which is striving or struggle, and that is true. However, there's also a Sharia or Shari definition of jihad, a legal definition, and this is the one that Muslims like Didat and others constantly never want to tell us. So he says it's used to refer to very different efforts that are enjoined, legally required by believers, right? And of course, no one has believed until Allah and His Messenger becomes more beloved than everything. Now, this, of course, is also defined in the Sharia. And he speaks of the best jihad is the perfect Hajj. Well, there's more than one verse to that effect, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but yeah, and then he says, your thoughts, Thaddeus, before you go on.
Yeah, well, this is a good example of him saying things which are technically true, but are painting a picture very different than the reality. Like, yes, the technical meaning of the word jihad is struggle, but the way it's used in the literature is to wage war against non-Muslims. That this struggle is personified or taken on as a way of war. So it's technically true that it means that, but it's really quite deceptive to act like that's what all it means.
Yeah, hold on. I've actually got this reference here. This is from the Talmud Sanhedrin 37a. So Quran 533 is a copy of the Talmud Sanhedrin 37a. Adam, the first man, was created alone to teach you with regard to anyone who destroys one soul from the Jewish people. If anyone killed one Jew, the verse ascribes him blame as if he destroyed an entire world, as Adam was one person from whom the population of an entire world came forth. And conversely, anyone who sustains one soul from the Jewish people, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sustained an entire world. And this is it from Sanhedrin 37a, verse 13, on safari.org. Just thought that would be interesting to see what the original context of that was and how it was corrupted within Islam. So then, defending Islam and the Muslim community is a primary aspect of the physical jihad, which involves taking up arms against an enemy. And then he says permission has been given, right, to fight has been given to those who have been attacked. Now, this is fascinating. He leaves out a great deal. He doesn't quote a lot of the actual Sharia. And this is also referring to the Sirah. This is actually a very clear reference to the Sirah here, even though it's mentioned in the Quran, but the Sirah gives much more detail on this. And he doesn't describe this very, very well. I'm going to go into some more detail as to how the Islamic scholars actually view this. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Well, yeah, he's again trying to imply that this is defensive. You're just taking up arms against an enemy. What he doesn't say is, and by the way, everyone who's not a Muslim is your enemy.
Yeah. So let's go to the Muqaddimah. Now, this is Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is the greatest historian to ever come out of Islam, and he's known as the founder of the discipline, the academic discipline of sociology. And he says in his famous book, the Muqaddimah, his greatest work, right, an introduction to history, which is the classic Islamic history of the world, he says, in the Muslim community, the holy war, and he says holy war is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or by force. Therefore, caliphate and royal authority are united in Islam. Thus, there is no separation between mosque and state or church and state, so that the person in charge, the caliph, can devote the available strength to both of them at the same time. He says the other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and the holy war was not a religious duty to them, except for the purposes of defense. It has thus come about that the person in charge of religious affairs in other religious groups is not concerned with power politics at all, and royal authority has nothing to do with religion. And so it comes to them as the necessary result of group feeling, which by its very nature seeks to obtain royal authority, as we've mentioned, and not because they are under obligation to gain power over other nations, as is the case with Islam. They are merely required to establish their religion among their own people. I think this is very clear. Where's Dedan? Why hasn't he come back?
I guess that when you timed him out, he gave up, unfortunately.
Oh. Yeah, so this is Ibn Khaldun. This is in Prospect Magazine, the man who invented modern history. And they speak of the enduring relevance of a 14th century Arab historian. He's even here on some money, right? I don't know sure not to which country that is, but he's actually very, very famous. He then goes on, the non-Arab nations became the servants of the Arabs and were under their control, right? Every craftsman offered them his best services. They employed seagoing nations for their maritime needs, right? They wished to wage the holy war by sea. They constructed ships. They embarked the army and fighters to fight against the unbelievers across the sea. This is premeditated warfare. This is deliberately choosing to invade. This was the special concern of the provinces and border regions closest to the shores of the Mediterranean, such as Syria, Africa, the Maghrib, and Spain. The Caliph Abdul Malik ordered blah, 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 that a shipyard be set up in Tunis for the production of maritime implements, as he was desirous of waging the holy war. From there, the conquest of Sicily was achieved in the days of Ziyadat Allah. So I guess we're going to hear that the top scholars of Islam are all liars again.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, they apparently invented a word that doesn't exist in Islam. So
yeah, no. So let's have a look within the Reliance of the Traveler here. So this is the Reliance of the Traveler. And this is the chapter called Jihad, right? That's section 09.0. And they discuss the meaning of jihad, then the scriptural basis. This is the religious basis for jihad and the obligatory character of jihad, and that it's a communal obligation, right? And about surrendering when overrun. This is not about struggle. This is warfare. Who is obliged to fight in jihad? Those who are not permitted to fight. The objectives of jihad regarding the Jews and the Christians, the rules of warfare, and those who are unlawful to kill. I don't know how struggle requires you to kill people. So yeah, let's have a look. Jihad means to war against non-Muslims and is derived from the word mujahada, signifying warfare to establish the religion. And then the translator adds this section, which is not in the original Arabic. This he added himself, and this is based on a false hadith. It is the lesser jihad. As for the greater jihad, it is the spiritual warfare against the lower self, which is why the Prophet said, as he was returning from jihad, we have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. This is regarded by Islamic scholars as false, right, as a false hadith. So non-conformity with the major hadith collections. In all 6 major hadith collections, jihad almost always refers to outward physical struggle and not inward spiritual struggle. There are nearly 200 references to jihad in Sahih Bukhari, and every single one assumes literal warfare. So, right. So I won't read every single reference to this, but really, this is it just goes on and it discusses it. We did this in a past show on jihad, and Ibn Kathir himself simply tells us that this is it's nonsense, right? Ibn Taymiyyah, he's a Shaykhul Islam, one of the most famous of the Islamic scholars. His fame is in his polemics against Christianity, and also he is the godfather of jihad. He is the most prominent, the most famous, the most quoted jihad scholar in Islam. There's a hadith related by a group of people which states that the Prophet said after the Battle of Tabuk, we've returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. This hadith has no source. Nobody in the field of Islamic knowledge has narrated it. Jihad against the disbelievers is the most noble of actions, and moreover, it is the most important action for the sake of mankind. Your thoughts, Thaddeus, before I move on to the Hidayah?
Yeah, it's interesting that we're told all the time when we quote Sahih narrations that, oh, that's a weak hadith, you shouldn't be quoting that. And then 10 minutes later, the same Muslim will quote us a totally fabricated hadith, not even a weak hadith, just a totally fabricated, made up hadith like this one about lesser jihad, or, one about the planets circling the sun, or about Muhammad being against racism. There's a few of them that are constantly circulating, and it's hilarious that when we quote actual legitimate sources, we're bad people who are just quoting fake, made up, weak hadith, and then they'll go on and quote actually fake hadith, and that's perfectly fine.
It's frightening that they will do that. So now I'll step forward to the Hidayah. As I said, this is the most complete, the most lengthy of the Sharia manuals, of the fiqh manuals, right? And book 9, Al-Sayyir, or the Institutes. And notice I've said before that the Muhammad Sirah, the prophetic biographies as they call today, the Sirah or the Sirat, plural. And it tells us here that Sir is the plural of Sirat, which in its primitive sense signifies regulation in the matters of spiritual and temporal. But Sir or Sirah in the language of the law applies to the institutes of the Prophet in his wars. So the Sirah or the Sirat refers to the wars or the battles of the Prophet, the battles of Muhammad, right? And it talks here, chapter 1, introductory, chapter 2, on the manner of waging war, chapter 4, of plunder and the division of plunder, and then of the conquest of infidels. That's you. The thoughts, Thaddeus, before I could go on?
Yeah,
the last two slides.
This is pretty interesting that somehow jihad just means struggle, yet whether it's the hadith or the sirah or whatever, or the sharia, whatever we look at, jihad almost exclusively refers to war. Apparently they're struggling a lot to wage war and not struggling so much for anything else.
Yeah, and actually, before we do that, let me just show you guys something. This is how Islam treats women. This is an example of a story taken from Islamic texts. Kirfa Fatima was taken prisoner. She was a very old woman, the wife of Malik. Zayd ordered Qais bin al-Musahaf to kill Kirfa, and he killed her cruelly by putting a rope into her 2 legs and tied her to 2 camels and drove them until the camels tore her in 2. This is from the History of At-Tabari, volume 8, pages 95 to 97, and in Ibn Ishaq, page 980. This is what Muhammad's people did. This is how they respect women. So yeah, just something that out of interest. So don't get caught in a war with the Muslims. Yep. So this now is inside the Hidayah. War must be carried on against the infidels at all times by some party of the Muslims. War must be carried on at all times against the infidels by some party, a small minority. The sacred injunction concerning war is sufficiently observed when it is carried on by any party or tribe of Muslims. It is then no longer of any force with respect to the rest. As long as some Muslims are killing in the name of jihad, the rest are legally allowed to not do so, right? It is established as a divine ordinance by the word of Allah, who has said in the Quran, slay the infidels, and also by sayings of the Prophet. War is permanently established until the day of judgment, meaning the ordinance respecting war, right? It is enjoined for the purpose, and notice, it is enjoined by Allah only for the purpose of advancing the faith. They're not speaking of defense. There's no defensive warfare here. It is enjoined for the purpose of advancing the true faith. It says, or repelling evil, but the primary motive is to spread Islam by the sword. And they mention here war. They speak of jihad fard, or ordained war, enjoining the various passages of the Quran to be waged against infidels. It is termed the holy war.
Yeah,
The thoughts,
yet another well-respected Islamic manual here that uses this term, which apparently does not exist in Arabic. Strange.
Yeah. So in the last 3 slides, so continuing, right? Party of Muslims making war. Okay, so when a single tribe or a party of Muslims makes war, the obligation of fighting in jihad and killing in jihad is no longer binding upon the rest of the Muslims, right? However, if no Muslims were to make war, the whole of the Muslims would incur the criminality of neglecting making war. So it is a crime in Islam not to make jihad upon non-Muslims, to force Islam upon them, to spread Islam. The destruction of the sword is incurred by infidels, although they are not the first aggressors, as appears from various passages in the sacred writings, which are generally received to this effect. That in other words, they must make war first, not in defense, but they must be the aggressors. Mm-hmm. So it says here, infidels may be attacked without provocation. And they mention here by the sword, right? The destruction by the sword here, right? It says the infidels may be attacked without provocation, and then by the sword or of the sword means qital. They always say, no, jihad, you're talking about qital. Jihad means no. They talk about qital, meaning war in its operation, such as fighting and slaying. Jihad means the same thing.
Yep.
And then they speak on the manner of waging war. So when the Muslims enter the enemy's country, and this manual goes on to say that if you're not a Muslim, you're an enemy, period, right? You besiege the cities or the strongholds of the infidels. It is necessary, invite them to embrace the faith. Ibn Abbas relates to the Prophet, that was Muhammad's cousin, don't forget, relates to the Prophet that he never destroyed without previously inviting them to embrace the faith. If they embrace the faith, it is unnecessary to war with them, because that which was the design of the war, the intent of the war, is then obtained without war. The intent of Islamic warfare is to make you embrace Islam. The Prophet has said, we are directed or ordered to make war upon men until such time as they shall confess that there is no God but Allah. And when they repeat the Shahada, their persons and their properties are protected. And if they do not accept, then they must pay the jizya or the capitation tax. And by submitting to this tax, war is terminated. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, I think that's pretty explicit there, that the purpose of waging jihad is to convert people to Islam. So I don't know where Bilal is getting this idea that it doesn't exist in Islam, but you looked at like 10 different sources and they all seem to disagree with him.
Yep. And then last two slides. So infidels must be called to the faith prior to making war upon them. So it says again, they have to initiate the war. They have to go first. It is not lawful to make war upon any people who have never been called to the faith, except it is entirely lawful and completely okay, right? So without previously requiring them to embrace it, because the prophet instructed his commanders, call the infidels to the faith, and because the people will hence perceive, that they are attacked for the sake of religion and not for the sake of taking their property. People must know. It's shocking, right? So I'll read that again. People will perceive that they are attacked. You have to know that you're being attacked for the sake of Islam, for the sake of religion, and not for the sake of taking your property or making slaves of your children. On this consideration, it is possible that they may be induced to agree to the call in order to save themselves from the troubles of war.
Yeah, clearly this is just defensive. You know, we see all these people who have never heard of Islam being instructed that you got to accept Islam or we're going to attack you. And it's all purely defensive. This is how Islam works, you know, it's all defensive no matter what.
Exactly, precisely. And then the final slide, this is the last slide. If a Muslim attacks infidels without calling them to the faith, he is an offender because this is forbidden. But if he does attack them before inviting them and he kills them and he takes their property, neither a fine, expiation, or any atonement are due because these are not Muslims, right? Because that which protects, namely Islam, does not exist in them. So you're not allowed to attack them until you call them to the faith. Only if they don't accept the call should you then attack them. But if you do attack them before telling them, and then you kill them and you take their property, it's okay. It's perfectly fine. It's not a problem, right? And in the same manner as the slaying of the women or the infant children of infidels is forbidden, but if a person were to slay the women or infant children, they are not liable to a fine. You murdered babies? Oh God, here's a 5 dirham fine. Shocking.
This is funny. Well, I mean, it's not funny, but it's ironic because Bilal was like, you know, the reason that we have laws against committing adultery and homosexual acts and whatnot is because it's for the benefit of society. But apparently there's no penalty for slaying women and children or attacking people who aren't Muslims and forgetting to invite them to Islam, because I guess that also is beneficial to society. I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, they say this is all sanctified by the law, by the Sharia law, right? And in fact, I mean, there's a reference, as Andrew mentioned, where they attacked a group of people before dawn at night, basically, without warning. They fell upon a Jewish village and they killed everybody without warning. They just assaulted them by surprise. And so therefore it's okay. So it's not okay unless you warn them, but it's, if you just do it, it's fine. It's not a problem. What law? You know, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's illegal,
So, yeah.
but there's no penalty. And as we know, penalty is the only thing that keeps people from committing crimes, according to Bilal. So I guess there is no, in all practical purposes, there is no law against this.
So they'll tell you in Islam, you can't kill women and children, except you can. And in fact, they love to tell us, but in Islamic warfare, you can't even kill to destroy trees. But if I go back to the Sharia, I can show you that, yeah, you shouldn't chop down the trees, except you can. And it's quite okay. You know, I mean, it's like, okay, fine.
Well, I mean, even if you were actually forbidden from chopping down trees, how would that remotely change anything? You can slaughter all the unbelievers, but don't destroy their trees. That would be wrong.
Yeah, this is Islam. And I mean, yeah. And Dina was like, yeah, I'm with all of this. I'm with this stuff.
Yeah, it's too bad that he left. We'd had to...
I'm very sorry, but Shiata or something said she was disturbed because he was disrupting. And
no, it's fine. I mean, usually people return after their time out. We know exactly what he would have said. He would have said, you guys are just lying. This is all untrue. And then we'd show the sources and be like, yeah, I believe in all that. What's your point? You don't have a point?
Yeah, he's been doing that for what, almost a year. Well, 6 months. I know you for about 6 or 7 months now.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's been doing that ever since. I mean, just shocking. How do you justify any of it? But I mean, we need to confront Muslims with this. These are the facts of their religion. But now, of course, their defense is none of this is true. All the scholars are lying.
Yeah, that's why I like T-Dot. He doesn't take that approach. He tries, but then he gives up really
But
quickly
don't
with
forget,
that
it took
approach.
me 2 months to get him to admit to that. He wouldn't admit to that before.
Yeah, now he doesn't even try anymore. You've really broken him down. He's just like, after one stupid comment, he's like, "Oh yeah, never mind. I agree with you."
Yeah, I mean, he's not able to argue with me because I know the Sharia way better than he does. And he went and he did a Dawah course. And And what's the result of the Dawah course? What
No
happened?
new arguments, that's for sure. We did
Yeah.
have a comment a good while ago, which I thought would be a good segue into other things that we will be talking about in the future. Love All My Moms quoted from a book called What Islam All About, which apparently is the most popular Islamic junior high school textbook in the United States, or at least was in the past. It says, a shabad or martyr is described this way by Allah. Don't think that those who were killed in Allah's cause are dead. No, they are alive, finding their bounty in the presence of their Lord. The law of the land is the Sharia of Allah. The duty of the Muslim citizen is to be loyal to the Islamic State. So I thought that would be a good segue into one of your presentations you want to do at some point.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, we wanted to talk about what's called the Tarbiyah, which is their madrasa guides, which is very similar to the Dawah manual but yeah, it's what they taught from the age of, say, 5 or so until the age of when they start going to mosque, 15 or 16 or whatever that is. And yeah, that is, yeah. So to go through one of these Tarbiyah guides would be useful for us to discuss, because it shows them how they are taught to interpret the Quran. They go through the Quran verses and they taught what they mean. They taught a number of different things: the meaning of ibadah, akidah, categories of shirk, the Islamic movement, the importance of prayer, the meaning of prayer, the conditions of prayer, the kinds of prayer, the obligatory acts, fasting. They just taught morals in Islam. It's quite detailed. And also they taught, in fact, these manuals all start off with anti-Christian polemics.
Yeah, which I think that looking at those will really be informative, because we see the same behavior over and over again in the comments. It doesn't matter what the Muslim wants to talk about, it doesn't matter what the subject of the video is. They'll do one of two things. They'll either deny the sources are true, or they'll just ignore everything and start attacking Christianity. And I think that when we look at these religious textbooks, it'll be very informative about the way the Muslim mind is formed as they're growing up. I went through a very large amount of religious education classes as I was growing up. The other religions other than Christianity were never mentioned once until like you get to the high school level, and then they're only mentioned from like a historical basis, kind of just give the basic history of how these religions came about. There's never any polemic arguments whatsoever against these other religions, just kind of like straight factual information. Islam was founded in 622 type information. And it's very, so, the Muslims, and I imagine most people who've had Christian education classes have a similar experience. So the Muslims are just coming from a totally different background, that they're taught from a very young age to hate Jews and Christians especially, but also
Yeah.
all non-Muslims, that they're taught that they're the best of all people and that anyone who's not a Muslim is the worst of all creatures.
Yeah.
And they bring that attitude to all the conversations they have with us.
Precisely. Tatuinen asked, didn't they make a mosque by Muhammad's grave? Because that's one of the last things he said when he died. He cursed Jews and Christians because we make temples at the sites of the graves of our prophets. Yes, they made a thing called the Al-Mashhad An-Nabawi, which is at the site of Muhammad's grave. That's known as the Green Dome.
Yeah, I remember when the coronavirus was first breaking out, Islamic scholar went public and said, we can end the coronavirus. All we got to do is open the roof of that mosque so that Muhammad's grave can send out prayers to the world. Very weird stuff.
Yeah. Some oddities, yeah. So any last questions from anyone in the stream? Because that's that's the presentation from me. I hope people found it helpful and useful and found some great references there.
Yeah, by all means, we're doing this not so much to entertain Christians. I mean, I do hope that you enjoy the presentation. I do hope you enjoy our banter, but it's not really our goal to entertain people. It's our goal to inform people. We put all the sources up on the screen so that you can look them up for yourself. You can copy and paste them into your own conversations with Muslims. Take this material and make Muslims be accountable for it. Don't let them distract and try to talk about other things, try to talk about 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, not 1. Ha ha ha, you people are idiots. Just ignore that stuff and make them be accountable for the actual subjects of the videos they're commenting on. If they're commenting on a video about how Muhammad bedded Aisha at age 9, don't let them distract by talking about something else. Make them actually answer for these things.
Yeah.
And likewise, in your private conversation with people in real life, maybe like don't the first time you meet a Muslim, don't be like throw all this material at them, but have this in your mind and bring it up in an unoffensive way. Like, I heard that say that Muhammad shoved Aisha or hit Aisha and it caused her pain. What do you think about that? And then if they're like, well, I don't think that's true, then you can like bring up the actual source or whatever. So
yeah, you're dealing with someone face to face, obviously be polite. But online, I just find that there are no honest Islamic apologists. Not one.
Yeah, I've lost track of how many Muslims I've had conversations with, but I know it's well over 100 because I looked up everyone who had come into my channel in the last 3 months, and it came to about 100 because I sent them all invitations to my Make Me a Muslim live stream. And I comment on other channels, and I've been doing this for well over a year, so I'd say I've probably spoken to between 500 and 1,000 Muslims just off the top of my head. And I can count on one hand the number of times that I've had a Muslim have what I would consider a legitimate conversation. Not that they made good points necessarily, but just that they acknowledged things that I said were problems that they didn't necessarily have any good answers for them, that kind of thing. The other 99+% of the time, it's either distraction or calling you a liar.
Yeah, but also you have to feel sorry for them because they are lied to by their scholars. I mean, David Wood has spoken about it, but I mean, we've had 5 episodes now demonstrating how their scholars are misleading.
Yeah, and Andrew Martin put it well. He said, an honest Muslim is soon to be an ex-Muslim. And as I said, I've only had about 5 conversations with people who were, actually considering the sources. And one of those, by the end of the conversation, was like, all right, I agree with you, I'm leaving Islam. So, if someone takes an honest look at the material, it doesn't take them very long to leave Islam. The real problem is getting them to take an honest look at it, which is why you got to keep pushing the Islamic material, not letting them distract and talk about Christianity. As long as they're talking about Christianity, even if you prove them wrong, it doesn't have any meaning because you're not attacking their actual basis for belief. They actually still think, well, even if Christianity isn't evil, like I was taught, well, Islam's still true, so it doesn't matter if Christianity is evil or not. It's still false, and I still don't want to believe that.
Well, I mean, they're at the stage now where I think they realize that we have started. I mean, they've always said, check with the scholar. So I took them at their word. I went to study the scholars. I read all of their best sources from their best scholars. And now all I get told is, yeah, that scholar was lying. That's a weak hadith. They'll deny Muhammad. They'll deny the Quran. I mean, they'll literally deny anything and everything. So, and then they'll say that the biggest information site for Islam in the world is false. That all the imams contributing there. I mean, you know, my frustrations. That is.
Yeah, and when people do this stuff like that, there's a couple of tactics you can take. One, you can be like, Islam doesn't allow you to deny Sahih Hadith. You're becoming an apostate just by doing that. And if they persist, be like, okay, I agree with you. Every Hadith is false. And you believe that the Quran is true, but the Quran was transmitted to us by the same people who are writing all this fake Hadith, who are making up all these nasty lies, according to you, about Muhammad. So why do you think they transmitted the Quran accurately? Why do you think that they didn't just add their lies to that as well? And I've never even gotten an attempt to get a reply to that question.
Yeah. Tituinen just asked, what is your biggest evidence against Islam? I mean, statistically speaking, for most people, for most Muslims, the reason they leave is the moral argument against Islam and Muhammad. That has the greatest impact. There were three, remember Thaddeus? There were three that we discovered, and the least powerful one, the still effective one, was the weakness of Islamic civilization, the lack of results that it produces versus Western civilization. But when you start to show that the standard Islamic concept of Muhammad versus the actual records from the Islamic doctrine and scripture, how they don't match up, how Muhammad had lice in his hair, how Muhammad constantly, I mean, there's about 30 hadith from Aisha at different times when Muhammad ends up with semen on his clothes and she has to clean them. In several, she says she scratched it off with her fingernails. How does the perfect man constantly end up with ejaculate on his clothing that his 6-year-old wife has to scrape off with her fingernails? When you start highlighting things like that, where he bathes with dead dogs, it gets crazy. When he's called a womanizer, his wife says that he pretends to be a prophet. You start to bring up all of this contrary evidence, and eventually they might start to doubt. But just reading out the actual when they lie and you bring up their own documents, I think that is a very powerful argument. I don't know, but what would you say in terms of for the falseness of Islam?
Yeah, so the moral arguments generally tend to be the most effective. The same is kind of true in proving that God exists. The moral arguments tend to be the most effective. But from a personal level, I find the historical arguments the hardest to explain on any kind of intellectual level. With the moral arguments, you can kind of take the approach that, yeah, that doesn't agree with my conscience, but maybe my conscience is wrong. Maybe it is okay to marry a 9-year-old girl. Most people aren't willing to do that, but you can do that. That is a step you could take. So for me, the historical arguments are the most powerful. Like, say, for example, the Quran copying from numerous human texts, many of which were not considered inspired, not considered scripture, and in many cases, not even considered historical by the authors that wrote them, that they are pure allegory. And then the Quran copies these things, passes them off as history, real human history, and says that this is the eternal word of Allah that was in existence before the first men and women were created. And that just makes absolutely no sense. You take a look at the city of Mecca, say, and you see what the archaeological evidence is showing, and it's showing that the city probably didn't exist at the time of Muhammad. And, that's kind of a little hard to explain. It was supposed to be like this great trade capital, and it either didn't exist at all, or it was, a village of 20 people or something. And you don't see any of the stuff referred to in the Quran. You don't, along the same lines, the Quran makes a lot of claims. It claims that there is a iron wall built by Dhul Qarnayn that's going to exist until the end of the days. And we look around and we can't find this. And you ask 10 different Muslims where it is, they'll probably give you at least 9 different answers.
I have 3 different ones today.
Yeah, because there is no answer. Or, you know, the Hadith say there's a giant mountain of gold buried in a specific spot. If Muslims actually believe their religion is true, why aren't they trying to dig up this gold? You know, there's just no historical basis whatsoever for anything in Islam. And I find from an intellectual angle that to be the hardest thing for someone to explain.
Yeah. There's a question in the comment about the weak hadith, the da'if hadith, like I mentioned. I'm not going to do the entire thing, that would take too long, but the Fath al-Bari is the most famous commentary on Sahih Bukhari. Now, we know that there's more than 100,000 hadith. I don't know exactly how many, but only roughly 4,500 hadith are actually in circulation today that we use, right, that are commonly used, but there's well over 100,000. Now, the scholars of Medina University, and I think Al-Azhar, collaborated to translate, these are the top scholars from the top universities of Islam, collaborated to translate the commentary, the Fath al-Bari on Bukhari, right? And they discuss that removing weak hadith from works was not the example of the scholars, right? Because the scholars themselves used them to take knowledge from. Weak hadith are used to support opinions because a weak hadith containing the words of the Prophet is preferred over opinion and personal reasoning. And this is the example set by all the scholars, including Imam Bukhari, who used them deliberately in his work Al-Adab al-Mufrad. And the Fath al-Bari says a da'if hadith, a weak hadith, and they always try to imply they are false, has up to an 85% chance of being entirely accurate. So the official formal Islamic scholarship grades weak hadith as 45 to 85% accurate. The grading was given may have been wrong, or the fabricator may have spoken the truth in that instance. Weak hadith should not be treated like fabricated hadith because there is an 85% chance of being entirely accurate, and that is a very high chance. And even in the Reliance of the Traveler, this most famous Sharia manual, the meaning of this hadith, and they mention a hadith that's weak, seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. The meaning of this hadith, though the hadith itself is weak, it is true. And there's more than one weak hadith in the Sharia. So just that short section there. So these answers exist in the Sharia, and they don't like it in their scholarship. It's all over. And then also, if to answer the questions about Muhammad, there's a reason they didn't talk about the Sirah, while they will talk about the Hadith, but not the Sirah, because there's lots of very humiliating, embarrassing evidence in the Sirah. For instance, Muhammad is the first creation of Allah. Allah created Muhammad 175,000 years ago, right? He then hung his light on a tree, and Muhammad sang praises to Allah for 70,000 years. Then Allah took Muhammad's light, put him on a lamp, and the soul and the spirits of all mankind in our paradise worshipped Muhammad. Okay, mankind worshipped Muhammad for 100,000 years. So for more time than Muhammad worshipped Allah, Muhammad was worshipped. Then Allah took a piece of Muhammad, the light of Muhammad, a fragment of Muhammad, and made Jesus and all the prophets. Every prophet was made from the light, the Nur-i Muhammadi, right? And then eventually Muhammad was born on earth, right? These stories and miracles, Muhammad hit a stone with the hammer when he was starving, and the stone crumbled to dust, and he fed 1,000 people with a single lamb and 3 kilograms of barley. You read this, and man, it just you start to read this, and that's why they don't want to talk about it. Their Sirah, their most famous Sirah, you got to read these stories. It's shocking. He's Jesus. They make him Jesus. They want him to be a miraculous divine being, and it's incredible when you start to read through it, and that's why they don't want to talk about it. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not hard to see why they don't want to talk about this stuff. It's pretty embarrassing and directly contradicts the claims of the Quran. But that's okay, because in Islam, it's forbidden to apply rational thought anyway. So it doesn't matter if it's contradictory, because rationalism has no place in Islam. Irene said that Islam is just about money and worshiping Muhammad. I'm going to have to correct that, however, because it is also about sex.
Yeah, definitely warfare for money and sex for Muhammad. Yeah. So that's it from me. It's almost 3 hours we've been going.
Yep. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're not 100% sure what our next topic will be, but definitely stay tuned for that. We mentioned some of the things that we could be talking about. We might talk about women's rights. We might talk about the madrasa manuals. We might talk about the Muhammad that you never knew from the Sirah.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating.
We also want to look at how Paul did not contradict the Gospels or the Old Testament. That is definitely on our list there, since that's one of the favorite polemics of Muslims. So, let us know in the comments what you'd like to see most, and we will definitely try to do that.
Yeah, I'm very active in the comments. If anyone needs information, back to me. I have shared these presentations with many people. I don't know what they do with them. I have no idea, but I do share them, and I'm very active in the comments. If you need information, I have a huge database. So yeah, please ask away, and hopefully this helps you. Thank you.
Yep, and as usual, feel free to take any portion of the video or the entire video or whatever, share it with others, and spread the word. I make this material not for my own benefit, but for the benefit of Christians who want to reach Muslims, and hopefully for directly reaching Muslims. So take the material, use it. That's exactly what we want. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day, whether your day has just begun or is coming to an end. We know that people are watching from all around the world. So wherever you are, God bless you, and have